was a shock offensive that came out of nowhere, a rebel push so strong and decisive that it punched through battle lines that had been frozen for half a decade. Exploding outward from a province under siege, legions of resistance fighters are now capturing territory in all directions as regime forces in their path and Russian warplanes overhead prove unable to stop them. It's just a few days from the start of the rebel advance, and already Syria's most populous city has fallen. The rebels are marching east, they're marching south, they're marching north, and the Syrian regime isn't even marching in retreat, they're running full tilt from the most obvious sign yet that Syria's remaining few dominoes are starting to fall. So in this special episode of Warfronts, we're headed to the Battle of Aleppo. Not the 4-year siege that began in 2012, but the battle that began and ended in the final days of November 2024. Alright, before we begin, we've got to provide our usual disclaimer here. As always, there is a period of latency between when these episodes are written and when they're released, especially because it was the weekend yesterday. As such, the information we discuss within this episode is accurate through to 12:01 a.m., the start of the day on Monday, December 2nd local time in Aleppo, where of course this battle is taking place. Now, we fully expect this situation to continue evolving in the days to come, so if you're interested in seeing future updates, please let us know in the comments. Now, in order to understand what's going on in Aleppo right now, we must begin by stepping back and looking at Syria as a whole, because as massive as this rebel attack on Aleppo undoubtedly is, it's just one of a dozen such forces at work inside Syria. A bit under 3 months ago, we here on Warfronts, which at the time was called Warographics, we published an extended episode on the subject entitled "The Syrian Civil War is Restarting Right Now." Now, if you'd like a really in-depth explanation of the recent state of affairs, go ahead and check that out after this episode, of course. But for today, we're going to give a quick overview of the groups working at cross purposes in Syria, because as we explained in that prior episode, the entire country has been showing signs of a slow descent back into full-scale war. We'll start with the Syrian regime, which exerts steady control over much of the country's heartland and south, including the major cities of Homs, Damascus, and until a couple of days ago, Aleppo. The man at the head of this regime is the same as ever, longtime dictator and dynastic heir Bashar al-Assad. The country's second largest landholding organization at present is the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, also known by the name Rojava. The Rojava government is led by Syria's ethnic Kurds, a longtime power player in the Syrian conflict that's managed to live mostly peacefully on the territory it controls. In the north, the Syrian interim government holds a large stretch of land and claims that it's Syria's sole legitimate opposition government. The Islamic State holds several pockets of territory out in the far desert and is increasingly showing signs of resurgence. Meanwhile, unrest against the regime is brewing in several areas, particularly the southern provinces of Daraa and Suwaida, while a network of Iran-backed militias operate with impunity and frequently receive regime support in the countryside. Now, a number of other nations are active inside Syria, but 3 deserve particular mention. The country's northern border, Turkey, backs the Syrian interim government, holds a large buffer zone of its own lands, and conducts frequent operations against Kurds in Syria. Russia backs the Assad regime directly, while the United States maintains a limited counterinsurgency presence near the country's 3-way border with Jordan and Iraq. But the organization that just turned all of Syria on its head is the so-called Syrian Salvation Government, controlled by the rebel coalition Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, as we'll be calling them for the remainder of this episode. Now, HTS is designated as a terror organization by the United States, Russia, the UN, the EU, and others, and it's been historically affiliated to Al-Qaeda under the name Al-Nusra Front. Over the last several years, however, HTS claims to have cut its ties with Al-Qaeda, and since 2019, it's held large portions of a single Syrian province in the northwest, the governorate of Idlib, along with the city bearing the same name. Its hold on Idlib has kept mostly stable for several years, and during that time, HTS has been working to convince both the West and the people of Syria that it's left radicalism behind and now plans on building up Idlib as an autonomous region. Among the group's other goals, however, were a little nugget that went largely overlooked in the statements of HTS leader Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, as he declared a new and fundamental goal for the group last year in May of 2023. Quoting directly from al-Jolani there, "Aleppo is the gate to Damascus, and it will be under focus for 1 or 2 years." Check the clock on that statement with the benefit of hindsight, and, well, here we are, aren't we? Over the last few weeks, northwestern Syria has been abuzz with signs that something was coming. The Assad regime had spent months escalating its activity on the fringes of Idlib, not doing anything truly massive to attack the heart of HTS or its allies, but maintaining a very troublesome pressure via artillery barrages and suicide drones that would probably get worse if HTS didn't respond. Embattled, encircled, and without the level of foreign support that most Syrian factions get, HTS didn't outwardly seem to be ready to fight back. But the group's own leaders apparently knew different. HTS and a range of allied forces began to mobilize. The rebels began to drop hints to local and international press that they'd been working for months to prep a large-scale offensive, and it became increasingly clear that Aleppo would be the ultimate target. Finally, on November the 26th, 2024, the Syrian regime launched its latest attack, an artillery barrage on the city of Syria, in which 16 people were killed, including 2 children, and 12 more were wounded, including 8 more children. The response by HTS began the following day, November the 27th, and it wasn't meant only to avenge the deaths in Syria. It was dubbed Operation Deterrence of Aggression, and it was to be a lightning assault, effective immediately. The first day of the HTS offensive was a ruinous one for the regime. Over 20 towns and villages fell to the rebel assault in the first 12 hours, with violence both consolidating HTS's hold around some of the further-flung villages of Idlib, where the government had set up shop, and claiming towns on the road to Aleppo. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a UK-based organisation that is the de facto leader on tracking minute-to-minute casualties in the Syrian civil war, around 40 government and allied soldiers were known to have been killed during the first day, alongside about 60 members of the opposition. But we should bear in mind for the duration of today's episode that the real-time death toll statistics will almost certainly be unreliable, and with the fog of war and the mutual incentives for both sides to hide their true losses, the numbers are likely to be an undercount. By the end of the day, up to 180 combatants were suspected to have been killed, along with at least 19 civilians that the observatory had catalogued as killed in retaliatory airstrikes by both Syria and Russia. On that day, the HTS-led assault was able to bring down the base of Syria's 46th Regiment, a military unit that has long led the artillery and drone harassment against the forces and people of Idlib. Dozens of soldiers were captured in the offensive, and as the day wore on into the evening, local press was reporting that HTS forces hadn't just smashed through the first line of regime defenses around Aleppo. Within that same day, they were in the process of breaking through the regime's second set of defensive lines, taking over high ground, and opening the way to critical breakthrough areas that would have to fall before Aleppo was taken. During the fighting, HTS forces or their allies were able to ambush a vehicle carrying Russian special forces who are known to be on the ground in Syria, providing protection and military advice for the regime. As HTS armored bulldozers smashed through regime roadblocks, as checkpoint after checkpoint was entirely overrun, HTS was able to capture advanced weaponry, several T-55 tanks, a well-stocked depot of guided anti-tank missiles, and apparently some sophisticated weapons that they got off that Russian patrol they ambushed. Alongside HTS, evidence emerged that brigades of Syrian Palestinians and fighters from Hezbollah were present in support of the rebel attack, alongside members of a wider consortium of anti-regime forces that HTS has worked hard to build. They were also joined by elements from the Turkish-backed Syrian interim government, perhaps at Turkey's instruction. That Syrian interim government involvement may, however, be a result of tensions with their sponsor Turkey over the nation's recent overtures to the Assad regime, which had, in turn, raised fears that Turkey could sell out its own proxy force. Over the course of the day, HTS unveiled a new military operations command, complete with social media, spokesman, branding, and other elements that indicated it had been in the works for quite some time. They also revealed a new toy, a cruise missile-like, indigenously produced projectile going by the alternating names of Zawam and Qassar. The missile reportedly carried a warhead of 200 kilograms and was used in surprise strikes against regime positions ahead of the ground assault. But if the first day of HTS operations was stunning, then the second day was ruinous for the Syrian regime. Coming down from the highlands with the full tactical advantage that a downhill attack confers, they crashed into the strategic district of Khan al-Assal on the city's outskirts, and bringing the rebels just barely 3 kilometers away from Aleppo proper. They were able to cut off the vital M5 highway, which the Syrian regime absolutely needed in order to rush soldiers and equipment into Aleppo from Damascus. Meanwhile, a second thrust of the rebel offensive cut southward, focusing initially on a town called Sarakeb, but consolidating control at a more southerly point of the M5 in order to set up multiple layers of defense that any regime counterattack would have to break through. On the second day, Russian fighter jets were mostly silent, while their ally Iran allowed its forces to start getting involved, but to ruinous effect. During the day, on November the 28th, a brigadier general of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps was killed in battle with the rebels. Both IRGC and allied militia forces are believed to have taken significant casualties as the advancing rebels encroached on majority Shia villages, where the IRGC and its many militia partners maintain a considerable presence. After about 20 towns and villages fell on the 27th, 24 more were captured on the 28th in patterns and locations that indicated that the Syrian regime's perimeter around Aleppo had largely collapsed. Over the course of the day, new information emerged on the makeup of the HTS forces, indicating that they were in possession of not just Syrian tanks and Russian advanced weaponry, but real expertise of their own. During the night from the 27th to the 28th, an elite HTS unit called the Thermal Brigades, Saraya al-Harari, launched assaults in units where every soldier was armed with thermal night vision scopes, sniper rifles, assault rifles, and rocket-propelled grenades. It was they who had kept up pressure on the strategic district of Khan al-Assal and forced it to the breaking point before handing operations over to another elite unit in the daytime, the so-called Red Bands, or Asayib al-Hamra. As they attacked, HTS revealed that they, like many other asymmetric forces around the world, have learned the greatest lesson of the invasion of Ukraine. Over the course of the day, the skies around Aleppo were filled with the incessant buzz of drones, both off-the-shelf consumer-grade quadcopters for reconnaissance and first-person view suicide drones that were used to neutralize regime defensive positions. They also used drones to scatter leaflets across regime defensive positions, encouraging the soldiers there to defect before it's too late. The second day's haul was also a hell of a lot more impressive than the first, with HTS and its allied organizations picking up more advanced T-72 tanks, several armored personnel carriers, a number of Russian-made drones, even more anti-tank missiles, and large quantities of ammunition. By nightfall on the 28th, it was obvious to all that the battle for Aleppo was nigh. A highly experienced, very successful military leader who's long thought to be a potential successor to Bashar al-Assad, named Major General Sahal al-Hassan, but widely known as the Tiger, had arrived in the city to take command. Around the world, experts watching the shock offensive anticipated that this is where the battle for Aleppo would transform from a steamrolling to a brutal and attritional affair. But by the time the sun set on the 29th, it was clear that those expectations had collapsed. In fact, it became clear pretty early in the day, whether due to a collapse in morale or due to a decision to withdraw from an unsustainable position, regime forces were already in the process of fleeing the city. After that, the result was an inevitability. Over the course of the day, on the 29th, HTS forces charged into Aleppo, collapsing what remained of the regime's front lines as they went along. They captured the governor's palace without much trouble at all. They brought down each of the 4 major intelligence directorates inside the city. They reached and began the process of clearing Aleppo's ancient citadel, and they took positions around Aleppo International Airport. Meanwhile, in the south, the town we mentioned earlier, Sarakeb, fell as expected, granting the rebels dominance at a critical choke point, without which an easy recapture of Aleppo would be near impossible. But rather than just hold the M5 highway as expected, the rebels pushed southward another 30 kilometers to the next city, Mara'at al-Numan. Not only would that city allow HTS to cut off other routes for Syrian forces to counterattack against the city of Idlib directly, but it was a major symbolic target for the broader Syrian revolution. In Aleppo, HTS took pains to reassure locals that they meant no harm and made specific promises to protect Aleppo's large Christian community, a much-needed reassurance given the group's reputation years ago as a Salafi jihadist terror organization. In a remarkably quick showing of its potential for civilian governance, HTS-affiliated civil administrators, particularly its Emergency Response Committee, were already sweeping western Aleppo by the day's end, helping residents restore water and electrical access and dealing with street debris and unexploded munitions. Well over 100 people were released from regime custody across the city, many of them refugees who had been detained arbitrarily. That's a common practice for the Syrian regime, and their release is taken as a show of good faith by nearly virtually every group across Syria. Alongside HDS and its close allies, the Turkish-backed Syrian interim government confirmed prior suspicions and surged into action in the countryside north of Aleppo. That attack, dubbed Operation Dawn of Freedom, is focused on areas to Aleppo's northeast, where it's assumed that the regime was relying on having stable territory. If that area were stable, the regime could have retreated or surged reinforcements through there, potentially even hardening into a defense. But the Turkish-backed forces, entirely unbothered by the events to the south, moved effectively to cut it off. With them cutting off the regime from the north, HDS waging an all-out assault from the west, and a massive bulwark of Kurdish territory acting as an immovable wall to the east, the rebels were able to ensure that when the Syrian military left Aleppo, they'd have to go much further south than anticipated in order to reconsolidate any defensive positions. When it came time for the most decisive day of all, November the 13th, HDS was entering a fundamentally changed organization from what it had just days prior. Its red bands and thermal brigades were still leading the charge. Its drones and homemade cruise missiles were doing the work for which they were intended, but they also brought to bear an even greater number of tanks, at least a dozen pieces of heavy artillery, even more drones, ammunition and anti-tank missiles, and the knowledge that the Syrian army was now in full retreat. And over the course of the next 2 days, November the 30th and December the 1st went precisely as expected. Rebel forces seized Aleppo's international airport as Syria admitted to the deaths of dozens of its soldiers and issued orders to cancel all flights for the foreseeable future. News emerged that Russian forces in the area were quickly wrapping up local operations and departing from their bases, while out along the highways leading south, the haste of the Syrian retreat was put on full display. Videos posted on social media show numerous armored vehicles abandoned, apparently out of gas, with those vehicles likely to be captured and put to work by HDS or their allies. From the air, Syrian and Russian fighters surged into action, while ground forces began to reconsolidate in areas far from Aleppo. Between the decision for air power to wait for the city's takeover to begin counterattacks and the early indicators that retreating forces may be falling back to a containment perimeter, it appears as if, after arriving to the city, Major General al-Hassan and his allies had realized their position was untenable within Aleppo and chose to minimize losses. The corresponding airstrikes hit numerous rebel gatherings and convoys of vehicles, including across Aleppo, and they are known to have killed a significant number of civilians. One state-run organization indicated that strikes had killed about 300 rebels, while targeting, quote, militant concentrations, command posts, depots, and artillery positions. According to Syria's military command, its forces now plan to, quote, carry out a redeployment operation aimed at strengthening the defense lines in order to absorb the attack, preserve the lives of civilians and soldiers. How much of that is tactical forethought and how much of that is code for "we just had a little panic and fled the city" is tough to say, but the truth is probably it's a mix of both. In Syria's defense, Russia has pledged that it will surge extra military aid to Damascus, while Kurdish forces indicate that they'd taken over some of the territory within Aleppo before HDS got there, similar to their modest expansion into other nearby areas that government forces had left. Yet even as HDS declared victory across Aleppo, it did something equally shocking, continuing its southward advance down the M5 highway rather than consolidating its position. After capturing the city of Ma'arat al-Numan and establishing a secure fallback point to protect Aleppo and Idlib, HDS made its way towards cities like Khan Shakun and Marek, indicating what their true ambitions for their offensive push may be. See, the M5 highway, it starts in Aleppo with a pre-war population of 2.1 million, but as you travel southward, you can directly or indirectly hit all 5 of Syria's biggest cities. South from Aleppo, you find Hama, pre-war population 300,000, then Homs, population 650,000. Then, by taking Homs and heading west, you can cut off Latakia, population nearly 400,000, and finally, you reach Damascus, population 1.5 million, including one Bashar al-Assad. In an apparent recognition that Hama was the rebels' next target, Syrian forces fell in around the area to prepare a, quote, strong defensive line in the north of the governorate. Whether that will be enough, however, remains to be seen. At the time of writing, HDS forces have pushed past Khan Shakun and Marek, coming very close to Hamas' outer limits, and they've started to cut westward toward Latakia, possibly in anticipation that regime defenses will shatter as easily there as they did around Aleppo. As we speak, the battles are almost certainly still raging in Syria, with HDS, the Turkish-backed rebels, the Kurdish forces, and more all bursting through restraints that the Assad regime had believed might constrain them. Syria's rebels now control all of Idlib province, nearly the entire city of Aleppo, major portions of Hama province, and a whole lot of military kit that they didn't have just a week ago. So now we've got to ask the question, well, what's going to happen next? Now, on the Assad regime's side, the rebel assault has exposed some major military failings, but there is a silver lining to that rather difficult reality. While the regime's forces had proved across months of artillery bombardment that they were potent when on attack and resistant to counter-attacking skirmishes, their defensive line snapped almost immediately when the rebels applied any real pressure. But now, Syria's more capable military leaders are on scene, and after more than a decade of civil war, the best among them do know how to get their shit together. They'll be aided by a new Russian commander of his country's forces in Syria, after the commander at the time of the attack, General Sergei Kissel, was relieved of duty. Not only that, but they'll be able to hold a handful of individual points along a more sparsely populated perimeter, rather than trying to guard against attack from all angles in the more dense Aleppo suburbs. Heavy weaponry is reportedly en route, while Iran-backed militias are believed to be making their way to the area. Finally, it's worth noting that they, and their backer Russia, have an overwhelming advantage in the sky. The rebels can try and shoot down their aircraft, but they can't fight them head-on. Reports have emerged that regime forces have been able to offer limited pushback against HTS, taking back a few villages, although it's unclear how long those positions can hold. We've also got to take a moment here and debunk a claim that circulated in the rebel advance's earliest days that Bashar al-Assad himself was facing a palace coup. Now, we can't say for sure that Assad won't be deposed as the pressure of a rebel offensive picks up, but he hadn't been deposed yet, despite reports on the 30th of explosions and gunfire in the capital as Assad was returning to Damascus from Moscow. Those attacks were purportedly launched by the supporters of Syria's State Security Director, General Hassam Luka, but whatever happened there, Assad seems to be just fine at the time of writing. On Sunday, December the 1st, possibly to ease concerns around his status, Assad made public comments to vow retribution, quoting here, "Terrorists only know the language of force, and it is the language we will crush them with." He made that statement while hosting Iran's foreign minister and appearing on camera in Damascus in a rather reliable confirmation that he is in fact alive and well. Meanwhile, the rebel side of the equation has its own bugs to work out. With their rapid expansion, HTS and allied forces are now pushing directly up against the territory of Kurdish Rojava, and although Kurdish forces have taken advantage of the opportunity to snap up a bit of strategically valuable land, they have thus far opposed the insurgency. Rojava's main fear seems to be that Turkey is directly involved or may have even laid the foundation for the attack. Turkey has a long history of attacks and offensives against the Kurds, and per Rojava, their current involvement is meant to displace Kurdish people in Syria's northwest. HTS has asked some Kurdish troops in the areas near Aleppo to retreat toward consolidated Rojava territory. For Turkey's part, it's not clear that Turkish troops or intelligence are present on the ground, but the nation has indicated that it intends to return up to 100,000 Syrian refugees to territory in Aleppo province. The decision of the Turkish-based forces to support HTS is further support that this offensive may advance Turkey's interests. We mentioned before that the Turkish-backed rebels might be skeptical of their sponsor after recent attempts to normalize relations with Syria, but there's another side to that coin. Those normalization efforts have recently fallen apart, and while it's possible that Turkey's rebel allies would be skeptical of Turkey's reliability, they may also be more than happy to take part in a possible Turkish attempt to punish Syria's refusal. In the coming weeks, HTS, the Turkish-backed rebels, the Rojava government, and others will have to come to terms on how they can move forward. But they've also got some pretty incredible incentives to try and build a status quo or even an arrangement to attack Syria together. If they remain broadly fractured or distrustful of each other, there are limits to what each group could achieve. But if they can get past their differences, the military rewards could be huge. In the northwest, an extension of HTS's current offensive could combine with a push from the Turkish-backed rebels, possibly traveling through HTS territory or even attacking from Turkey itself. In that region, HTS could take the city of Latakia or potentially even strike as far southward as Tartus, capturing a broad stretch of Mediterranean coast in the process. While Assad's forces may consolidate around Hamar, forces near Latakia will have a harder time digging in, and if the forces defending Aleppo shattered so easily, then it's an open question whether the forces around Latakia could provide much resistance. Meanwhile, if HTS and Kurdish forces can work together, they could take massive amounts of territory and oil in Syria's less populated heartland. If the rebels can take Hamar and force the regime to commit to the defense of Homs, they'll gain access to another key highway that might allow them to attack Palmyra in the heartland. In such a push, Kurdish forces could use their own territorial position to create a second half of a pincer offensive. And all across Syria, other groups will need to account for the problems that HTS just exposed in the regime's front lines. As an American former ambassador to Syria, Robert Ford explained to NPR, quoting here, "What this shows is that the Assad military forces were hard. I mean, they could inflict a lot of casualties, especially on civilian targets, but they were very brittle. The regime is obviously very weak, and its external supporters are much weaker than they were a couple of years ago, and frankly, much weaker than almost anybody expected. That's a problem that the regime can fix, as we've said, in defense of a place like Homs or Damascus, but probably not across the entire country. The Rojava government and their Kurdish paramilitaries will now be looking to re-examine their long front line with the regime, considering where they might force a breakthrough. Smaller insurgencies, particularly in the southern province of Daraa, might make use of local militia alliances they formed very recently and make a play for provincial control. On the more foreboding side, it's possible that resurgent Islamic State forces could take advantage of this moment of weakness and re-establish territorial control, conduct prison breaks, or wipe out competitors while the regime is distracted. When we described Syria as a powder keg a few months ago, and when we did the same here, this is precisely what we meant. One seemingly small, localized spark, and this entire conflict can very quickly turn back into a multi-dimensional all-out war. If and when that broader conflagration begins, we'll return here on Warfronts to cover it. Until then, watch the news carefully out of Syria, and make no mistake, the fall of Aleppo is going under the radar in much of the Western world, but it shouldn't be. And there's a very high likelihood that the situation will get worse before it gets better. Thank you for watching.